Welcome to this lecture on Frank Gehry. I'm Larry Wayne Richards, Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. It's a privilege to talk about Frank Gehry, arguably the world's most famous architect. It's also a great challenge. Where does one begin? Perhaps here, with this image of twisting shapes with light, drama, and brilliance. I've known Frank for 40 years, and indeed there are many Franks. There's Frank, the renegade artist, pictured here with Ed Moses, Frank, the proud Canadian, the hockey player, Frank, the loving family man, pictured lower left with his wife, Berta, and Frank, the responsible citizen. Each of these is a story in itself, a story about his long life, his 94 years, all of which began in Toronto in 1929. Frank is all of these. However, I'm going to focus on form making and Frank's role as a brilliant architect. Frank is indeed an artist architect. And I think it's fair to say that he thinks like an artist, conceptualizing, manipulating ideas, composing space, adjusting proportions, scale, texture, color, and light. He sculpts and sort of paints, and the compositions become highly abstract, even dreamlike, as seen in these views of Rebecca's restaurant and the lobby of Disney Concert Hall, both in Los Angeles. Here we see deep, layered, flowing, exhilarating forms and spaces. Frank acknowledges his affinity to the complex geometries of 17th century Baroque sculpture and architecture, that of Lorenzo Bernini, Francesco Borromini, and Guarino Guarini. Here we see the animated marble of Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, Borromini's undulations in the facade of San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, and his helical staircase in the Barberini Palace, and also the towering telescopic dome by Guarini in the Chapel of the Holy Shroud in Torino. I find this affinity entirely convincing. The curves and folds, the drama, the dynamism, the sensuality, the mystery. The parallels are all there, bursting with shade, shadow, and reflected light. And then the fish, what Frank rather ineloquently refers to sometimes as the goddamn fish. Today I'll spare you the complete story of Frank and fish. It's very complicated. But in his early practice, he claimed that the fish preoccupations had to do with his Toronto grandmother, who liked to put a carp in the bathtub before she made gefilte fish. Then he later kind of revised that association with his grandmother and the fish in the bathtub, instead saying that fish forms for him really are about mythology and primitive origins. And he loves the double curves, the movement of the fish. There are fish lamps, like this one made of Formica color core chips, and many fish-like buildings. There seems to be some inner urgency on the part of Frank, some driving need for Frank to do fish. Like this giant gilded stainless steel sculpture for the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. The Barcelona fish was also part of a breakthrough moment some 30 years ago, when his office started employing higher technology such as CATIA software from the aerospace and automobile industries. Frank's office discovered more efficient, precise ways to generate and construct complicated curves. And in introducing this work, it's crucial to talk about Frank the urbanist. He studied urban planning at Harvard, immersed himself in the sprawling grandiosity of Los Angeles, and believes deeply that buildings should reach out to and draw in the city and its surrounding landscape. Here in Bilbao, the museum is talking with the elevated expressway, with the river, and with the mountains beyond. Broadly speaking, Frank's architecture turns itself inside out, drawing in and pushing out the spaces of the city. It is his sculpting on a very grand scale. And now a few statistics about Frank. He has completed about 300 projects. He's done about 900 altogether, but 300 completed in 18 countries. There are 260 books on Frank and his work, and it's interesting to compare this with another Frank, the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who lived to be 91 and died in 1959. Frank Lloyd Wright, in his lifetime, did 1,114 projects, with 532 of them realized. So Frank Lloyd Wright's batting average was about 50%, whereas Frank has realized about a third of his proposed projects. It is, in any case, a very substantial body of work, and as I noted, spread across the world in 18 countries. I have divided my talk into 3 20-year, roughly chronological periods, representing different phases in Gehry's long career. While preparing this lecture, this image of Frank Owen Gehry, who loves ice hockey and who flaunted this particular aspect of his Canadianness for a Knoll Furniture advertisement. Well, there's this text in the ad that kept speaking to me. The text reads, "How to twist the rules of the game." And I thought, yes, that's Frank in more ways than one. He twists metal, he twists wood, he twists in the most imaginative ways the experience of architecture. And so, Twisting the Rules became the subtitle of this talk. I also want to note that with just 2 exceptions, I have visited all of the buildings that I'm going to be talking about. I think it's important to experience a place and to know it firsthand whenever possible. Frank opened his own office in Los Angeles in 1962. He had moved to LA in his late teens, moved from Toronto with his family to LA, and he attended the University of Southern California, completing an architecture degree there. As I noted, studying urbanism at Harvard for a while, and then returning to LA to open his own office in 1962. But I'm actually going to start with the 1970s, when he became known for his interests in everyday stuff and inexpensive, rough-hewn materials. Think cardboard, formica, plywood, chain link fence. So let's look now at some of this iconic architecture from the early period of the 1970s and 80s. I met Frank through the Toronto Globe and Mail architecture critic Adele Friedman. Like myself, she was drawn to this surprising, shocking work of Frank Gehry. And we helped bring Frank to Toronto for a lecture in the early 1980s. We also made several trips to LA. We ate with Frank at Rebecca's, the creature-laden little restaurant that he designed in Venice, a few blocks from the Pacific, and we went to the temporary contemporary museum that he had designed. We visited Frank's home, and we happily traipsed around the city, seeing tons of crazy stuff by Frank. No story of Frank Gehry and Toronto would be complete without mentioning Adele Friedman. Now let's look at the house that Frank did in Santa Monica in 1977-78 for his growing family. Frank and his wife Berta were expecting their first child. They lived in an apartment, and evidently Frank's mother thought they needed a house for the growing family. So Frank was a little reluctant about this idea of a house, and he was concerned that maybe it was too soon for the world to focus strongly on his house design. So, as the story goes, he sent Berta looking for a house that they might renovate. They bought a kind of nothing salmon pink bungalow in Santa Monica, and Frank did a big number on it, wrapping it in new spaces, clad with corrugated metal, timber, plywood, and glass. Neighbors were not amused. What was this shocking creature that Frank had created? There was a big fuss, but the world soon took note. Something really extraordinary had happened. The sculpted, outrageous-looking thing that Frank and Berta now called home. Indeed, it's a light-filled, beautiful place. You can see a view of the kitchen, which has an asphalt floor, rather unusual material for a kitchen. But this was part of Frank's brilliance in using ordinary materials to create something entirely new. He says he was, quote, trying to trap the ghost of cubism inside. It was all very strange, a collage of ordinary materials and stuff packed with creative tension between the old salmon pink bungalow still peeking out and the dynamic wraparound of the new construction. Frank said, quote, "I think we all agree that buildings under construction look better than most buildings finished," end quote. And this sensibility is fully on display in his house. Well, another very interesting thing happened. Looking at this photo with Frank in front of the house, we see at the front door how the front facade is sort of split. And there's an interesting story, some notes recorded about that, and a book by Paul Goldberger, a book from 2015 called Building Art, The Life and Work of Frank Gehry. And I just want to read one paragraph from Goldberger's book. And it's about this slice in the facade at the front door. And this is the paragraph. The cut was not just a technique of model making. It was, in a sense, a metaphor for the way Frank was seeing the whole design, as a composition made of slices and slashes and clashes, of colliding forms and textures, solids and voids, all seeming random but considered as meticulously as any Miesian detail. If Frank's work had some of the quality of action painting, the house was like the sketches Franz Klein did on pages torn from the telephone directory, where Klein's new and bold lines of force played off against the more genteel, ordered background of the old printed page. Here, Frank's architecture was Klein's brushstrokes, and the old house was the printed page of the telephone book. I thought that was a kind of very wonderful way of describing this moment and this process in the making of the facade. In the house, the manipulation of light is brilliant. It's a very strong Southern California light, and as in the Baroque, it now is in the service of abstraction, and, as Frank said, trapping the ghost of Cubism inside. During these visits to Los Angeles, Adele Friedman and I visited many of Frank's works, including the Chiat Day offices. This is a composition of 3 very different architectural volumes, each having its own character. The middle one is the big surprise, this pair of giant binoculars, which resulted from Frank's collaboration with the artists Klaus Oldenburg and his partner Goscha van Bruggen. They incorporated this giant binoculars form hovering over the entrance to underground parking. Everyday objects, by way of pop art, become fodder to shock and amuse. A favorite of mine from this period is the Loyola Law School, a campus ensemble that Frank started working on in 1978. A central plaza is surrounded by a Hollywood stage set-like architecture. There are cubes and cones and temples and columns derived from classicism, but with a Hollywood stage set flair. I'm not sure how to describe a genuinely democratic architecture, but whenever I visited this place, I've been there several times, it has a genuinely welcoming, warm feel to it, a kind of special accommodation for its law community. There is an openness and looseness and casual quality that I found very, very comfortable. And then note on the upper left that flying out of the box stairway. It reminds me a lot of the wonderful twisting stair that protrudes from the back of the big blue box at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. So it's some 40 years or so apart between these projects, but we see some similar inclinations repeating with the stair jumping out of the box. Next, I'm going back a bit to 1969, 1973, and to a body of important furniture work that Frank started. It was called Experimental Edges and then Easy Edges, and these lines of cardboard furniture were quite astonishing. This early advertisement shows an array of chairs, tables, and stools. The furniture is concocted of layers of ragged cardboard. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. You can see in this picture at the lower right a Volkswagen VW Bug, and it's being supported by this surprisingly strong furniture. So 2,000 pounds of VW weight on these cardboard chairs. In many ways, Easy Edges foreshadowed many of the directions that Frank's work would take 3 decades later. Curvaceous, flowing, textured. Although not exactly made for kids and pets and everyday use, the edges are frankly quite easily damaged. These beasts remain incredibly engaging. On your right is a pair of the chairs that Adele Friedman still has, but now removed from everyday use and displayed on platform plinths. The final project that I'm showing in this early phase of Frank's work is in fact his first Toronto project, 2 floors of office space for the advertising firm Chiat Day. The Chiat Day offices were in a nondescript, glass-clad building at Harborfront, down near Lake Ontario. Completed in 1988, Frank worked with local architect David Fujiwara to produce the construction documents. The project only existed for 7 years, but it remains one of my favorites. I wrote about the project for the journal Canadian Architect in 1989, just a year after the Chiat Day offices were completed. And here is the cover photo from the journal. In the project, stepping off the elevator, one passes by tree trunk columns, maple columns, into a plywood-clad reception area. The reception desk is covered in soft white felt. And beyond the big surprise, a bathtub on a battered tin plinth. And here in the bathtub, what do we find? A leaping, twisting, battered tin fish. The space is in fact very dreamlike and also very Canadian, with its references to maple trees and so on. In this essay, and I'm only showing a few pages from the publication, I started with a quote from Frank. Frank said this, quote, "I think all of us are finally just commenting in our own way about what's going on in our cone of vision." And I titled the piece, "Mocking Up Life," because for me, that's what Frank did and still does. He brews, then distills the stuff of everyday life, representing life through his particular cone of vision. Well, something like that. In the conference room, there was a lovely rolled wood felt sculpted lighting fixture. Note the axonometric drawing. The workstations are configured along the windows, the whole composed as a square donut with the communal spaces at the center. It's in fact a symmetrical composition derived to a great extent by pre-existing symmetrical conditions. So the 1970s and 80s were tremendously important, very important decades in Frank's trajectory. It remains my favorite period in his work because of its humane ordinariness, inventiveness, and relatively low cost. This close-up of the Santa Monica house will elicit different responses from different people. Some of you will think of cubism maybe, or a Hollywood backlot, or somebody else might just think it looks like a junkyard. But this is part of Frank's magic, an open-endedness that transcends limiting specificity. To conclude part one, I've included this photo of Frank, an early photo of Frank, and you can see a cigarette dangling in his hand down near the bottom of the screen. I've arranged the photo so that he seems to be contemplating one of his own quotes, wherein he discusses painting, space, and cities. He says this, "I have always felt that artists and architects do similar things." And he says that for him, there is, quote, "a moment of truth," end quote. When things coalesce and take a direction in a building, making a building look like it does. The next phase of work, the 1990s and aughts, sees Frank gaining larger commissions and expanding his practice internationally. The buildings become much more curvaceous, and his office fully develops its computer-aided design capacity. This is the period when he becomes an internationally acclaimed star, acquiring the dreaded label of Starchitect. I want to show you one of my favorite buildings by Frank. I had the opportunity to visit the building in Prague, the National Niederlanden office building. It's remarkable in several ways. It both fits into and resists its urban context of historic conservative buildings. Although generally the same height and clad in stone, two bold volumes push outward and round the corner. One seems to lift its glass skirt, then skims over the roof as a penthouse. The windows jump up and down, and lines wave through the stone cladding. Well, like so many of Frank's projects, this resulted from a very extensive, exhaustive series of three-dimensional architectural model studies. It's a very rigorous process where Frank uses three-dimensional models with his associates adjusting, tweaking, and refining over and over at different scales until things seem just right. The process, of course, includes sketches and drawings, but the importance of 3D models cannot be overstated. Somehow the Prague building gained the nickname Fred and Ginger after Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, seemingly because it looks like a pair having a nice dance. The implied movement captured people's imagination. For Frank, I think it was about finding ways to do more architectural twisting and flowing. And of course, somewhere in the background of all of this is the influence of Prague's exquisite Art Nouveau period. The Prague twisting and curving continued big time in Frank's bentwood furniture, a project for Knoll. This project started in 1989 when Frank set up a furniture research lab next door to his office in LA. Accepting a long history of bentwood furniture, from Tonnet to Alto to Eames, Frank became preoccupied with the look and structure of such things as wooden fruit baskets and laminated hockey sticks. Now, this is probably a good moment to mention the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto. Frank Gehry, when he was growing up in Toronto, had attended a lecture by Aalto at the University of Toronto. And Frank was quite young then, and he reflects on that, saying it was one of the first times that the world of architecture became exciting to him. And then several years later, he visited Aalto's office in Helsinki. Anyway, Frank became very preoccupied with the look and structure of such things as wooden fruit baskets and laminated hockey sticks. And he named one of his chairs for Knoll in this particular series. He named it Crosscheck. And that chair, this group of chairs is pictured here. I visited the workshop lab a couple of times, observing the rollout of prototypes. Finally, some 120 prototypes. Amazing. The research and development went on for several years, and I bought my own Crosscheck chair. But within a few months, there were some issues, shall we say, and, well, more than issues. The glue failed and the chair literally fell apart. I contacted Knoll. They apologized. They said, well, we're having a few technical issues, and they quickly replaced the chair. The second chair that I received also fell apart. Anyway, Noel replaced that one, and I'm happy to say I've had that particular cross-check chair for a long time now and enjoy it very much. What can we say about these little technical glitches with the Knoll furniture? And I think this is largely a matter of these things being in the past, but I think it's safe to say that with this particular kind of structure and the bending and the laminating, there's a lot of torque, there's a lot of twisting of the layers and the various overlaps. Anyway, I leave you to think about this, and as I said, I think those technical problems have been solved quite a while ago. And now the big one, Bilbao, the Bilbao Museum of 1997. I regret that I haven't visited Bilbao, and I still have it on my list of places that I must see. Here we see Frank sculpting at a huge urban scale, with the titanium-clad forms grabbing and reflecting light, seeming to billow and sway. This was his first use of titanium cladding. It is a great and grand urban construct with some kind of magic that embraces and lifts people's spirits, as masterful works of architecture do. And in this sense, it is not unlike the Guggenheim in New York, or the Opera House in Sydney, or any number of Toronto's own wonderful buildings such as City Hall, Eaton Centre, or Massey College. The Guggenheim Bilbao exhilarates at every scale, from the city to the building structure to the dramatic interior spaces. When I look at the image, I'm reminded again of complicated, layered, curving architecture as in the Baroque, bathed in changing light. Well, how does something like this happen? How does Bilbao come about? I always emphasize that it's not just the creativity of an extraordinary architect, it's also the vision and determination of an extraordinary client. In this instance, the Guggenheim Museum and the Basque Regional Administration worked together with Frank to realize this great project. Great clients are necessary, not just great architects. In this instance, it seems that even Frank Gehry was shocked with the outcome. You can read his very to-the-point words here. "What the fuck have I done to these people?" That's what he was saying the first time he saw the building. Spain has many great cities and knows how to Spain has many great cities and knows how to protect and nurture them. It's impressive. We in Toronto remain, for the most part, reticent when it comes to architecture. A few years later, in 2003, Walt Disney Concert was realized in downtown Los Angeles. Frank started designing it soon after Lillian Disney contributed $50 million for the building in 1987, but it would take 15 years to reach the finish line. Architecturally a cousin of Bilbao, Disney Hall is likewise magnificent in its sculptural perfection and glowing presence. Terraces and landscape walkways meander around the building amidst its silvery sails. These bends and folds look so right, so easy, but we know that they resulted from Frank's eyes and his hands changing, adjusting, changing, adjusting. The exterior flows inside to a lobby that is simultaneously intimate and grand. One more time, I refer to Frank's love of the Baroque, with the lobby here likened to Bernini's sculpture. Finally, the Disney building is about the magnificent hall inside, where I've experienced two amazing concerts. The acoustics were done by the famous acoustician Minoru Nagata. And by the way, Minoru Nagata also was the acoustician for Toronto's Four Seasons Ballet Opera House, which both of them have extraordinary acoustics. Disney Hall has 2,265 seats and is encased in the warmth of wood. It's surprisingly intimate. Frank says, quote, "I wanted this concert hall to express the joy and the feeling of music." Equally beautiful are the organ pipes designed by Gehry and Manuel Rosales. They constitute a kind of sculpture within the sculpture. And I think there's kind of no other word for these organ pipes. Even though the word is overused a lot, I think stunning is appropriate here. In 2006, around the time Disney Hall was completed, I curated and designed an exhibition titled Frank's Drawings, 8 Museums by Gehry. This was first shown at the University of Toronto Art Center, then at the Patricia Farah Gallery in Santa Monica. I mention this exhibition because it's important to examine Frank's drawings, the wiry, exuberant scribbles through which he imagines and develops buildings. This poster announcement features some of his sketches for the Panama Museum of Biodiversity. The exhibition in Toronto and Santa Monica included original drawings and also display cases with piles of Frank's yellow notepad doodles. Frank, for years, he would sit at his desk working on something, maybe on a telephone conversation, and he had a yellow notepad, and he would scribble and doodle, rip off the pages, throw them aside, and then at the end of the day, his staff would collect these and dutifully save them. And there are literally thousands of them. So we just sort of piled them casually in the display cases, and this was a very popular part of the exhibition. The drawing exhibition was both about process and about paper artifact, and the central role that drawing has in Frank's creative process. Here is one of the wall displays showing the Samsung Museum of Modern Art in Seoul, South Korea. This was a wonderful proposal that Frank did that was never realized. Some other architects gained the commission finally. Frank's drawings have been studied closely and exhaustively. For example, this book from 2004, 544-page book, simply called Gehry Draws. In this book, there's an analysis of one of Frank's drawings, a drawing after Michelangelo's rebellious slave. And here I show you something from the book, Frank's drawings, and the comparison with the Michelangelo. Next, I want to look at the Art Gallery of Ontario, located in downtown Toronto. It's a meandering story from the lovely Grange of 1817 to the current planning for a major addition by Boston architect Annabelle Seldorf with Diamond Schmidt Architects of Toronto. But looking back to Frank's role in this collage of buildings, wearing his urbanist hat, Frank faced the formidable task of recollaging the work of many previous architects. Plus, there was the Grange Park itself and the bold, hovering checkerboard Ontario College of Art and Design University building by Will Alsop. There were many concepts for the AGO Art Gallery transformation. I wrote about this particular design process in chapters in 2 books by the Art Gallery of Ontario about Frank and his design process for the project. Frank's design concepts for the AGO were gradually diluted, but nevertheless, a new and wonderful whole resulted and opened in 2008. I love the big blue box facing south. However, the long gallery and porch along Dundas Street form the primary urban signature for the AGO. And here we see a view along Dundas Street at night. The building looks really good. It's this kind of glowing fish skeleton along the street. Fantastic at night. But it's north-facing and a little less resolved, shall we say, during the daytime. Anyway, the long gallery volume is quite spectacular. And again, we see some interior views of that particular gallery structure. And then we find the historic Walker Court. Now, I have mixed feelings about Frank's insertion of this spiraling, sweeping stair. It's very bold, it's exhilarating, but it, let's say, has a lot of presence in the historic court. And some people have found it somewhat compromising in terms of the genteel nature of the court. It's also interesting to note that the Walker Court was among Frank's earliest and most memorable experiences as a kid exploring Toronto. He tells the story of going to the Art Gallery of Ontario with his mother and going into the Walker Court and then seeing great works of art. It made a big impression on him. Well, and finally, back to the fish skeleton, as I call it, stretching along Dundas Street. The Art Gallery of Ontario is iconic Gehry, and accepting that it is a renovation and series of additions, it is also to date his largest completed project in Toronto. There have been so many, well, it almost happened, but not quite, projects by Frank for the city and the surrounding region. And in some ways, it's a bit disappointing that some of these other great projects by Frank weren't realized, but such is life for architects. Now a major Gehry project is rising on King Street West, a mixed-use project sporting a pair of condominium towers, represented in this image just to the left of the CN Tower. It's a project that is called Forma, Italian for form. Let's head into this final section, the 2010s, 2020s, in which Frank is really giving full expression to his work and in many cases going tall, going very tall. The preoccupations in this latest chapter in Frank's long career, a career that spans 60 years, gives us a kind of look into his full expression and very tall buildings. I'm particularly fond of the apartment tower that Frank designed at 8 Spruce Street, not far from where the Brooklyn Bridge snakes down into lower Manhattan. And that's on the far right in this image, at the very far right, where the bridge is going down into Manhattan, you see this very sculptural tower. Number 8 spruce sometimes looks like two shaky towers, somehow kind of colliding and merging into one. Designed soon after the 9/11 tragedy, a friend of mine has speculated that Gehry's tower design carries memories of that shocking two-tower event, that pair of tragically collapsing towers. Perhaps. But the desire for waviness and folding and layering has always been there with Frank. Think cardboard and easy edges. The folds and the waves soar up and down, in and out of the facades. There are moments when this reminds me of the great Chrysler building, not far away. But in this case of number 8 Spruce Street, the impulses have gone a bit mad. This dynamism makes the apartment interiors quite wonderful. And note here the huge windows and really remarkable, breathtaking views. The New York Tower on the left leads us into the now under construction Toronto Towers, a computer-generated image of one shown on the right. The Toronto Towers will be more chunky, cranky, cubistic, and it seems perhaps with smaller windows. Here again, the Toronto Towers, known as Forma, are shown in the skyline. Frank's original scheme for David Mirvish had 3 towers, and quite a few of the existing historic buildings on the site along King West were to be torn down. However, city planners became concerned about the heritage aspects and the density of the 3 towers. After much to and fro, the scheme was reduced to 2 towers, somewhat to Frank's dismay. The first tower is now on the market and, as I understand it, sold out. And this tower's under construction. It's suggested that sales will commence soon on the second tower. In a 2018 essay, I included Frank's Toronto Towers at the end of my writing, and I said this, quote, "These sculptural landmark totems by Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry will incorporate industrial fabrication using computer-driven manufacturing, enabling extreme heterogeneity of the architectural components. Appearing like giant, twisting metal robots in friendly conversation, this pair of towers, 73 stories and 80 stories, signal a new techno-postmodernity." Now, Frank wouldn't necessarily like my reference to postmodernism. He shuns labels. He doesn't like being called a postmodernist or deconstructivist. He usually just prefers being called a modernist. But he might agree to this notion of friendly robots in conversation. Okay, let's move on to Paris now. This lovely UFO that landed in the Bois de Boulogne in 2014. The Louis Vuitton Foundation, under the guidance of Bernard Arnault, realized this project working closely with Frank Gehry. It's a museum and a cultural center. The foundation also wanted an iconic building for the 21st century. Its cost was high, supposedly 780 million euros, or about 1.1 billion Canadian dollars. The Louis Vuitton Foundation is full of vitality, very exuberant. And my experience there on a rainy day in 2016 was wonderful. In 2016, when I was there, the French artist Daniel Buren was invited to create a work in close dialogue with the building. His project, which is called Observatory of Light, which you see here, engages the surface of the entire building, more than 3,000 panels, I think more like 3,600 panels, each one of them curved and unique. Daniel Buren put these colored films on the panels, totally transforming the experience of the place. It was amazing, both inside and out. The center contains signature spaces and elements by Frank, from inherently social active ones to the kind of gentle, contemplative white gallery space that we see in this image. My most enjoyable moments at the Louis Vuitton Foundation was up on the roof, where there are walkways and gardens and these kind of umbrella canopies which expose the structural sophistication of the building. If you look closely, it's a composition of wood, steel, glass, with highly articulated connections. It's a feast for the eyes. And of course, the views are nothing short of spectacular. Nearing the end of my talk, I've included this modest community arts center for underprivileged youth, the Beckman Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles Center. Shorthand, the Beckman YOLA, Y-O-L-A. It's in the Inglewood area of Los Angeles, and it opened last year. Frank renovated a dilapidated mid-century, there was a mid-century modern bank that had become a Burger King, and this organization took over the mid-century building to create the first permanent home for the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. It was completed on a very tight budget of $14.5 million. And here I'll note that Frank is always proud of and adamant about his projects meeting the client's budget. I think most of the time he in fact does this. I think it's largely true. He is, broadly speaking, an artist, but he is also intensely committed to social responsibility. The world might have labeled him as a star architect, but that's not the genuine Frank that I know. His heart is elsewhere, in a better place, and part of that, I believe, stems from growing up in progressive Toronto. So there are, finally, many Franks. Frank the artist, Frank the Canadian, Frank the family man, and Frank the socially responsible citizen. All of these wrapped up as one of the world's and history's most accomplished architects. So in this final image, we're sort of at the end, but also back at the beginning. And one final time, looking at these beautiful, twisting, flowing, glowing forms of Frank Gehry. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through some of his work.